we need to talk about a huge paradox at the heart of the youngest generation. I mean, they have more opportunities than pretty much any generation before them, but at the same time, they're also the most anxious. So why is that? We're going to unpack the data, look at some surprising causes, and explore this fundamental choice we all face. Are we building for comfort, or are we building for character? Let's get right into it.
So, here it is, the big question. With all the tools and opportunities at their fingertips, why is Gen Z also the most anxious and depressed generation ever recorded? You know, the answers, as we're about to see, are way more complicated than you might think.
And this isn't just some catchy headline. This is how experts are describing an entire generation. And get this was before the pandemic. It really paints a picture of a generation that's quietly struggling on a massive, massive scale.
Okay, so to really get a handle on just how big this is, we've got to look at the numbers. And believe me, the data tells a story that is pretty hard to ignore.
What's just so striking here is the contrast. Look at that. 42% of Gen Z say they're battling depression. That is nearly double the rate of older Americans. This isn't just a little blip on the radar, it's a huge generational shift.
So, what is going on? What's driving these numbers? Well, the sources we're looking at point to two really powerful, interconnected forces at play. Two, you could say, hidden traps that are fundamentally shaping the Gen Z experience.
All right, so the first trap is one we all kind of know, right? It's the digital world. Gen Z is the first generation to grow up completely immersed in this stuff, and it creates this relentless 24/7 feedback loop of comparison on platforms like TikTok and Instagram, which just sets these impossible standards. It's a world where stress gets amplified by things like cyberbullying and a totally never-ending stream of negative news.
But then there's a second trap. And this one is way more subtle, and it's one that might actually come from our best intentions. It's the way we've started using the language of therapy in our everyday lives.
Now, to understand this, we need to talk about a concept from medicine called iatrogenesis. It's basically when a treatment or a cure accidentally causes more harm than good. Think of it like a medication that has a really, really nasty side effect. The theory here is that our cultural obsession with therapy speak might be having a similar unintended consequence on our mental health.
And this chart shows exactly how that happens. Just look at the shift. Things that used to be seen through a moral lens, like a character flaw or a vice, are now being framed in these therapeutic terms as a symptom or a mental illness. Even just everyday negativity can get labeled as trauma.
And here's the real kicker. When everything becomes a symptom that needs to be treated, our personal agency, our belief in our own power to overcome challenges, it just kind of disappears. Responsibility gets swapped out for a diagnosis.
And this brings us to a really fundamental choice, a real fork in the road between two very, very different ideas about what it even means to live a good life.
So let's look at these two paths. On one side, you have the happiness hunt. This path is all about chasing comfort, avoiding anything difficult, and putting self-care above all else. It's an approach that tends to frame any negative feeling as a kind of trauma. But then, on the other side, you have building resilience. This is a much more active approach that accepts suffering as a part of life, and it sees challenges as opportunities to grow stronger.
And we see this happiness hunt everywhere. I mean, the most popular class in the entire history of Yale University wasn't about economics or history, it was literally about happiness. Nearly a quarter of all undergraduate students signed up for it, which tells you a lot about our collective desire for a smoother, less bumpy emotional ride.
Okay, so if the hunt for happiness is actually a trap, what's the way out? Well, the sources offer a pretty clear, actionable framework for building that resilience instead.
Let's break down how this works. It really comes down to 4 key steps. First, you've got to prioritize your digital well-being. Less screen time, more real-life connection. Second, focus on learning practical life skills and coping mechanisms. Third, embrace some objective accountability for your actions and your outcomes. And finally, for those who really need it, make sure therapy is effective and accessible. But here's where it all gets a little tricky. Gen Z is the most vocal generation ever about mental health, right? But there's this weird disconnect when it comes to actually, getting help.
Take a look at this number, 37%. That's the percentage of Gen Z who still believe that seeking therapy is a sign of weakness. I mean, that's a surprisingly high number, and it's actually higher than older generations.
And it doesn't stop there. Another 34%, that's more than a third, admit that they're not being completely honest with their therapists. This points to a major gap between talking about mental health in public
and really engaging with it in private.
All of this brings us right back to that fundamental choice. A choice that this generation, and maybe all of us really, are facing right now.
And this is such a key insight from the sources. Look, therapy and medication are incredibly important tools, no doubt, but they have their limits. They can't, on their own, teach us something called moral realism, which is basically the understanding that suffering is a natural and maybe even an instructive part of being human.
So, let's just recap the whole thing. The mental health crisis facing Gen Z is absolutely real and it's measurable. It seems to be fueled by these twin traps, the digital world and the overuse of therapeutic language. This all creates a core choice between passively chasing happiness or actively building resilience. And the path forward? It's going to require both individual action and some bigger systemic changes.
Which brings us to one final big question to leave you with. As a society, what are we really aiming for? Is the ultimate goal to maximize comfort, or is it to build character? Because the answer to that question is going to shape the future of an entire generation.